Is this okay? Yeah. I thought I'd start with the Fanon text, Dying Colonialism. And although I only assigned the second chapter, Voice of Algeria, I'd like to start with the first chapter, Unveiling Algeria, because I think taken together, the two chapters will give us a lively sense of the work of media, the category of media, help us to think more sharply about what is the work that this category of media is doing. Yeah, I think some others were there.
Two more are there. They'll be joining.
Yeah, okay. I don't know if you recall in the first day, I think I mentioned something that my colleague Alan Feldman has observed, which is on the one hand, you have von Clausewitz's remark that war is politics by other means, and you had an older observation by Machiavelli that politics is war by other means. Yeah? And Feldman has drawn attention to this phrase, by other means, and suggested that, of course, what is involved here is precisely what we would call media. And if we interrogate this notion of by other means, on the one hand, we notice that it is media that separates the difference between whatever difference we want to maintain between war and politics, it is on account of media. In that sense, media carries a lot of burden. It does a lot of work. And we should be thinking very sharply about media, not as a transparent, source of information, but rather as something to ponder, something that we have to figure out, because conflicting frames of interpretation, clashing bodies of knowledge may be mixing up, and they are being delivered through what we call media, and unless we pay attention to the fact of the clash, and are sensitive to the dynamics of the clash, we risk not understanding what is going on. Yeah? And I think for that, this text by Fanon is very helpful, offers a very helpful set of illustrations. Now, you may know something about Frantz Fanon. He was from a French colony, Martinique, in the Caribbean, near the United States, actually. But it was a French colony. He went to France for his education and trained as a doctor, and eventually got exposed to psychoanalysis. There's some very interesting discoveries being made about how he was exposed to the certain Spanish psychoanalyst who really widened his frame of thinking and so on. And then as a black, an African Franco Caribbean native, he was exposed to French racism, and he responded with in a very critical way, you could say. And when he was, he became a doctor attending to those who were victimized by the Franco-Algerian War, which began in 1954. He was assigned to Blida, one of the locations in Algeria, French Algeria, where he was psychoanalyzing both French and Algerian trauma victims and torture victims on the Algerian side. And he got a chance to engage with these people, not simply in terms of what they are supposed to think or supposed to say. He was analyzing their dreams as well. Yeah, so he was able to bring elements that normally excluded from such discussions, elements of the unconscious, and tie them into a larger framework of understanding, which he was developing as someone who was also engaging with the National Liberation Front of Algeria. Yeah, so he also took up arms. I don't know exactly what is the sequence of events here, whether he was a psychoanalyst by day and a soldier by night. I'm not quite clear about that. But he was involved in the resistance, and the I think extremely sharp and piercing analysis that we find here is thanks to the Algerian struggle and their analysis of the colonial occupation of their country, and how they translated their resistance struggle into prose, if you like, into the prose of kind of a revolutionary analysis of the kind that Fanon offers. So I think there's a great deal to be learnt here. And as I mentioned earlier, this should be a classic text in media studies, but often it's not to be found in media studies, except in my department. If you come to New York, everybody teaches it. So here's some, I didn't have time to create slides and so on, so I've excerpted some sections from the first chapter. The second chapter, to some extent, we'll have to go back to the text and we'll scroll through and pick up what we're able to, and also happy to answer any questions you have about what is this section or that section of the text saying. So the initial conquest of Algeria was the 1830s by France. And if you look at the map, Algeria is like 5 or 6 times bigger than France, large population. And it was treated and assumed to be France itself. They called it French Algeria, but the sense was that they cannot give it up because it is what makes France great. A very similar spirit characterized the British in regard to India, we should recall. All these European countries were small countries that were made big by their colonies, literally, physically, but also in their imagination. Yeah? So to give up their colony meant to admit that they were in fact a small country. There was a great deal of resistance to doing that. And France was a laggard in the process of decolonization. 1945, the end of World War II, United Kingdom began to give up its colonies. India got its independence, Pakistan got its independence, but France held on until I think 1961 or 1962, and it was an extremely bloody battle between the Algerians and the French, beginning in 1954. And while the Algerians had very little by way of weapons, the French would practice aerial bombardment. So there is one section where Fanon refers to the victims of Sétif and Guelma, 45,000 victims due to an aerial bombardment over just, I think a couple of weeks. So if you think about it, during an entire year in Gaza, that's the kind of number we're hearing about. So this was the most savage conflict of that time. And so the Algerians got a lot of world sympathy. And the French had a difficult problem of, you might say, public relations. And but when the French practiced rural operations, the world did not necessarily come to know about it. When the bombardment was very heavy and spectacular, as in Sétif and Guelma, people came to know. But in general, this was under the radar for most of the world. So the FLN took the decision to move the battle into the city of Algiers. And that is what is shown and captured in the film Battle of Algiers, which Dr. Reddy has said we can see in class, because on the 13th we have two sessions. One of those sessions we can watch the film and discuss it and so on. And as I said, there's an amazing correspondence between what the film tells us and what this text tells us. So they do illuminate each other. So just very quickly to tell you what happens in this Battle of Algiers. Already, so in 1953, Stalin dies. Yeah, and until Stalin dies, there is a fear about provoking nuclear conflict, and there is a certain amount of restraint that the Americans, display. A certain amount of restraint. At the moment Stalin dies, they feel emboldened, and especially these two brothers that I mentioned to you, Allen Dulles, head of CIA, John Foster Dulles, who became Secretary of State, both of them hard ideologues, but very different in temperament. And they carry out a coup in Iran, they carry out a coup in Guatemala, and the Algerian conflict starts. And the French are fighting tooth and nail. Even the left wing in France is pro-torture. They want to hang on to Algeria. 1 million French people have settled in Algeria. That's where they can have, large homes. They can have servants. They don't want to give it up. At some point in the late 50s, the issue enters the United Nations. And so in the film, we'll see references to the United Nations and how to, how those diplomatic talks are going on about Algerian independence. And what is interesting here is that the United States, on the one hand, needed to retain France as an ally in NATO. And of course, as a white colonialist, they were blood brothers, so to say. But there was another face that the United States had, which was post-war, post-imperial world leader, yeah, and a counter to the Soviet Union, which had already declared that every country ought to have a democratic rule, and they were against colonialism. So the United States was obliged to provide some fitting response to that kind of posture in the Soviet Union. For some reason, Soviet support to Algeria, there was no evidence of Soviet support to Algeria. Therefore, the United States felt safe to support the Algerian struggle, but under the radar, not in public, but in private, in diplomatic negotiations. And probably it is that pressure that eventually obliged the French to say, okay, we'll withdraw. The publicity costs are too much, whatever it is. Yeah. So although the film Battle of Algiers ends with the blowing up of the hideout of where these freedom fighters are have secreted themselves, a little bit later, independence is granted to Algeria because of these boardroom discussions far away in New York City between the parties. So in a sense, it's not a continuous stream of events that unfolds through its inner logic or dynamic. There are things happening in different places. They are brought together by the film. I'll talk about the film later, but now to get into the text by Fanon. And do remember, this is a time of considerable geopolitical ferment in the world. There's already been the Korean War, which the Chinese have already sort of joined the side of North Korea. Well, Korea essentially was moving to communism. They declared an interest in communism, and so world powers moved in to steer the conflict in their way. China, emerging world power at the time, so United States above all, they crushed it. They leveled South Korea. That's another story. But then there was also Dien Bien Phu in Vietnam. So these events were like ricocheting off each other. None of them happens in isolation, right? So the decision by the Algerians to launch their struggle is keenly sensitive to what's happening outside in the world, and when they sense that they have an advantage that they could possibly utilize, they launch an armed struggle. This happens in 1954. And a bit later, Fanon joins them, and to that we are indebted this very brilliant text. And what Fanon brings up here again and again, which highlights this category of media that I'm talking about, is that there are discrepant frames of knowledge that the colonizer and the colonized utilize, that they do not mesh with each other, they do not flow into each other, that unless you abandon this frame and adopt this other sort of lens, this way of viewing the conflict, you cannot understand it. And the beauty of the text is he gives us example after example of how it is the case that, to put it in the language of media, to treat the category of mediation simplistically would be highly misleading. It would actually cause you to misunderstand what is going on. Yeah? Let me just pause here. Any questions? Right. Why does the French government not put an end to the Algerian war? Why does it refuse to negotiate? Is this clear? Why does it refuse to negotiate with the members of the Algerian government? Such are the questions that an honest man in 1959 is entitled to ask. 2/3 of the world's population is ready to give to the revolution as many heavy machine guns as we need. And if the other third does not do so, it is by no means because it is out of sympathy with the cause of the Algerian people. Quite to the contrary, this other third misses no opportunity to make it known that this cause has its unqualified moral support. In other words, the world is behind the Algerians, and yet injustice towards them, violence towards them, is carrying on. How does that happen? The power of the Algerian Revolution henceforth resides in the radical mutation that the Algerian has undergone. Yeah? In other words, the process of mediation is not a passive process. It transforms everything that is being mediated. It transforms those who are within the process of mediation. Unless you understand that, you're missing something crucial. Yeah? General de Gaulle, who was a World War II hero and eventually makes the decision to grant Algeria its independence, addressing himself to Algeria's extremists. These are the extremists from the French side, okay? The far right within France, declared, "Papa's Algeria is dead." That is quite true, but it is not the whole truth. Big Brother's Algeria is dead too. There is a new Algeria, an Algerian nation, an Algerian government. These obvious facts will sooner or later have to be recognized. We shall see in these pages what transformations the consciousness of the Algerian has undergone. What we Algerians want is to discover the man behind the colonizer, this man who is both the organizer and the victim of a system that has choked him and reduced him to silence. He will go on to point out that women are actually crucial to the struggle, but the conventions of writing at this time lead him, of course, to have a completely male-centered language. As for us, we have long since rehabilitated the Algerian colonized man. We have wrenched the Algerian man from a centuries-old and implacable oppression. We have risen to our feet and we are now moving forward. Who can settle us back in servitude? Okay, so he's describing a condition of political insurgency, which he's, of course, advocating for at the same time. Unveiling Algeria. Now here he's talking about the women's clothing. And it's significant that's the first chapter in the book. The first chapter in the book because in the French conception, as they are planning to make their colonization effective and strong, they focus on the woman as the key to their potential success. Yeah? And in a way, it's ironic because the woman in Algerian society is largely invisible. They are not out in public. If they're out, in any case, you can't see them. They are sequestered. It's by its own admission, a male-dominated society. But they have a theory. The sociologists, the anthropologists, they are all coming in. And let's recall, these are the roots of these disciplines of, the understanding the populations of the world in order to govern them. Yeah? And in this analysis, the woman, in the French analysis, emerges as the key figure whose transformation will lead to the effective subjugation of Algerian society. Yeah? And he starts with the question of clothing. It is by their apparel that types of societies first become known, whether through written accounts and photographic records or motion pictures. Thus, there are civilizations without neckties, civilizations with loincloths, and others without hats. The fact of belonging to a given group, cultural group, is usually revealed by clothing traditions. In the Arab world, for example, the veil worn by women is at once noticed by the tourist. We shall see that this veil, which we can think of as a medium, yeah, and we look at the play of this category of medium in this story, we shall see that this veil, one of the elements of the traditional Algerian garb, was to become the bone of contention in a grandiose battle on account of which the occupation forces were to mobilize their most powerful and varied resources, and in the course of which the colonized were to display a surprising force of inertia. In other words, the colonized did not want to change. They did not want to say, yes, of course, what were we doing? For millennia, we have oppressed our women. Oh my God, how stupid. Let's stop it. You know, that was not their reaction. And Fanon explains how we can understand their reaction. So he's addressing the standard European reader who expects enlightenment in a kind of jaldi lao. You know, he's saying, this is why that's not happening. The officials of the French administration in Algeria, committed to destroying the people's originality and under instructions to bring about the disintegration at whatever cost of forms of existence likely to evoke a national reality, directly or indirectly, were to concentrate their efforts on the wearing of the veil, which was looked upon at this juncture as a symbol of the status of the Algerian woman. At an initial stage, there was a pure and simple adoption of the well-known formula, let's win over the women and the rest will follow. And I should say, I'm reminded when I read this of, you know, I was fortunate to be able to attend a conference between academics and the advertising industry in India, between Ogilvy and Mather and various social scientists, where almost exactly the statement was provided by the advertiser saying, we have to zero in on the mother, Again, we can't miss the militaristic overtone of this formulation. Yeah? Let's win over the women and the rest will follow. This definition of policy merely gave a scientific coloration to the discoveries, quote unquote, of the sociologists. This enabled the colonial administration to define a precise political doctrine. If we want to destroy the structure of Algerian society, its capacity for resistance, we must first of all conquer the women. We must go and find them behind the veil, where they hide themselves, and in the houses where the men keep them out of sight. Okay? It is the situation of women that was accordingly taken as the theme of action. The dominant administration solemnly undertook to defend this woman, pictured as humiliated, sequestered, cloistered. It described the immense possibilities of woman, unfortunately transformed by the Algerian man into an inert, demonetized, and indeed dehumanized object. The behavior of the Algerian was very firmly denounced and described as medieval and barbaric. Okay, so very familiar set of tropes here, saving brown women from brown men, white men saving brown women from brown men. Yeah, the formula repeats itself over and over again. One of my, as it happens, good friends was co-founder of an organization called Women saving Afghan women. Yeah, so that kind of trope does carry on. And she's a friend, but these tropes carry on, is what I'm saying. Yeah. Mutual aid societies and societies to promote solidarity with Algerian women sprang up in great number. Lamentations were organized. We want to make the Algerian ashamed of the fate that he metes out to women. Okay, so they're attacking one element of the society, thinking this is surely the Achilles heel, that when the whole world understands how the Algerian men treat their women, they will be on our side and not on the Algerian side. Yeah? Can I pause here? And if there are any questions or comments? Just reading on.
Somewhere, indicates few things in India as well. The political thing we will discuss later. But there is this campaign, Murgi Shikli Pragati Zali. So there was this campaign in Maharashtra about eradication of illiteracy.
I see.
So the focus was on educating women folk in rural India
Ah.
or in Maharashtra. So the tagline of that campaign was Murgi Shikli. Murgi is
Girl.
Shikli is padhai,
Padhai.
learning. So Murgi Shikli Pragati Zali. So basically, if a woman, if you teach or make
Yes.
a woman literate,
Yes.
that will lead to progress.
Yes, yes.
So
Yes, yes. Similar things in Tamil Nadu, other states, very much. Yeah, yeah.
probably this is the
Yeah.
maybe the root.
Yeah. Well, but you are opening up the question of internal colonialism, which is much more complex.
In fact, sorry, I was thinking this last sentence, convening the woman, winning her over to the foreign values,
Yeah.
wrenching her free from her status. So I'm thinking, for example, most women of my generation, somehow, especially the ones who get educated, who are urban and so to say modern,
Yes.
are actually like this. We always believe that wrenching or let's say letting go of whatever has been told to us as traditional makes us a modern woman. And now I'm thinking whether this was a colonialist agenda, always.
Yes, yes. But is that complicated by recent trends? That would be a question for later. We can have that discussion. Yeah?
Parallel to
Yes.
this would also be found in the history of Indian colonialism,
Uh-huh.
where one of the important issues on the early kind of Renaissance period
Mhm.
in India under the British regime.
Early Renaissance, you mean the Bengal Renaissance? Or?
Bengal Renaissance was the empowerment of women in some way or the other. So Lord Bentinck,
Social reformers.
social reform.
Sure, Raja Rammohn Roy, etc.
So women has always been the kind of location where the colonizers would like to focus and
Yes.
prove that they are there to liberate.
So the resistance also, yes, sure. Quite right. Sati, yeah. Raja Rammohn Roy saw his sister-in-law being burned to death.
Argument being about that the brown man needs to be tamed.
Yeah.
And this very university, is named after Savitri.
Savitribai Phule, yes.
So, and their effort was significantly supported by the local British officers and so on. So
Right.
that has always been the kind of.
So you're saying, yeah, but I mean, the tension was still there. There were, as you indicate, there were liberals and there were conservatives in the British side also. So that's a complicated domain. Sure. In the large population centers, it is altogether commonplace to hear a European confess acidly that he has never seen the wife of an Algerian he has known for 20 years. At a more diffuse but highly revealing level of apprehension, we find the bitter observation that we work in vain, that Islam holds its prey. Okay, so this is how the colonial conception is being sort of articulated. Even within the framework of a newly independent nation, one cannot attack this or that segment of the cultural whole without endangering the work undertaken, leaving aside the question of the native psychological balance. Okay, it's a long sentence, but we'll come to the point. More precisely, the phenomena of counter-acculturation must be understood as the organic impossibility of a culture to modify any one of its customs without at the same time re-evaluating its deepest values, its most stable models. Okay, so what he's saying is the French assume you can take apart the Algerian society like a Lego model, take out one block and put out another block, and to that Fanon replies there is a kind of organic character to it, so that one part will affect every other part, especially if it is done by a colonial power. It becomes the object of attention for the entire society, so that it's not going to be so simple at all. Yeah? To speak of counter-acculturation in a colonial situation is an absurdity. The phenomena of resistance observed in the colonized must be related to an attitude of counter-assimilation, of maintenance of a cultural and hence national originality. Okay, so there is a desire or need for integrity, for maintaining your integrity. You can call it conservatism. You can call it conservatism. We want to preserve our traditions, but in the context of colonial oppression, that becomes politicized. It acquires a political character, right? So it's not in the inertia phase of tradition. It becomes something more dynamic. It's galvanized. For a European not directly involved in this work of conversion, what reactions are there to be recorded? The dominant attitude appears to us to be a romantic exoticism strongly tinged with sensuality. And to begin with, the veil hides a beauty. Okay? So what you cannot see, you assume is desirable, right? It hides a secret which you must, of course, penetrate. A revealing reflection, among others, of this state of mind was communicated to us by a European visiting Algeria, who in the exercise of his profession, he was a lawyer, had had the opportunity of seeing a few Algerian women without the veil. These men, he said, speaking of the Algerians, are guilty of concealing so many strange beauties. It was his conclusion that a people with a cache of such prizes, of such perfections of nature, owes it to itself to show them, to exhibit them. If worst came to worst, he added, it ought to be possible to force them to do so. Yeah? So these are the rights of beauty, so to say. Beauty has its own, force which has to be allowed to manifest. But there is also in the European the crystallization of an aggressiveness, the strain of a kind of violence before the Algerian woman. Unveiling this woman is revealing her beauty, it is bearing her secret, breaking her resistance, making her available for adventure. Hiding the face is also disguising a secret. It's also creating a world of mystery, of the hidden. Yeah? So what he's referring to here is that in part the colonizer's occupation is a dominion over whatever is visible. Right? The visual domain is a means by which the colonizer exerts and reproduces his power. Yeah? So when you block the sight of the colonizer, that is perceived as an aggression towards the colonizer, as hiding a hostile intent. And that's the kind of argument Fanon elaborates here. Whenever in dreams having an erotic content, a European meets an Algerian woman, the specific features of his relations with the colonized society manifest themselves. These dreams evolve neither on the same erotic plane nor at the same tempo as those that involve a European woman. With an Algerian woman, there is no progressive conquest, no mutual revelation. Straight off, with the maximum of violence, there is possession, rape, near murder. The act assumes a paraneurotic brutality and sadism, even in a normal European. This brutality and this sadism are in fact emphasized by the frightened attitude of the Algerian woman. And here I'm also reminded of that cartoon we saw of the frightened Indian woman, in the shadow of the governor. Yeah? And we can talk about that as well. A attention must likewise be drawn to a characteristic of this dream content that appears important to us. The European never dreams of an Algerian woman taken in isolation. On the rare occasions when the encounter has become a binding relationship that can be regarded as a couple, it has quickly been transformed by the desperate flight of the woman who inevitably leads the male among women. In other words, into the harem. The European always dreams of a group of women, of a field of women, suggestive of the gynecium, the harem, exotic themes deeply rooted in the unconscious. The European's aggressiveness will express itself likewise in contemplation of the Algerian woman's morality. Her timidity and her reserve are transformed in accordance with the commonplace laws of conflictual psychology into their opposite, and the Algerian woman becomes hypocritical, perverse, and even a veritable nymphomaniac. Okay, so here you see the importance of disentangling the clashing knowledge frameworks that the colonizer and the colonized utilize, and the fact that you have apparently one medium, this idea of media, which is funneling all of this to you, can mask the fact of this clash, and it's imperative that we are sensitive to it. In the face of the violence of the occupier, the colonizer himself found himself defining a principled position with respect to a formerly inert element of the native cultural configuration. In other words, what was inert before the colonizer arrived has been galvanized by the colonizer's arrival and intervention. Yeah? So again, there is no passive retention of an old meaning here. Things are continuously subject to transformation. Yeah? In an initial phase, it is the action, the plans of the occupier that determine the centers of resistance around which a people's will to survive becomes organized. To the colonialist offensive against the veil, the colonized opposes the cult of the veil. Okay, so this is the something that would be, I'm sure, familiar to all of you. Maybe I pause here to ask if there are any comments or responses to what's been said, to what Fenno is arguing. Yes.
When you said, when you talked about the medium
Yeah.
now, you meant like the visual, the, the field of visuality.
Any channel of information, any so-called flow of information,
Okay.
brings together discrepant knowledge frameworks. They contain the battle, and unless you're aware of the battle, you are going to be confused. You are going to be,
In this particular case, what was the media that was used? It was, I mean,
So you have the veil. So, so the veil is presented as a form of oppression of women. Yeah, and for the untutored, that would seem self-evident. That take the veil off, let the beauty shine forth, let them, enjoy their human rights, and the Algerian side would not be visible at all, except through acts of violence. There would be no medium that would carry their press releases. I mean, that was not the context in which they operated. It was only by, carrying out acts of violence that they came into the news at all. So in the most unfortunate way, you could say. And they had to struggle against that bad press. And this text itself is part of the, you can say, the media battle, yeah, that's going on, right? What was an undifferentiated element in a homogeneous whole acquires a taboo character, and the attitude of a given Algerian woman with respect to the veil will be constantly related to her overall attitude with respect to the foreign occupation. The colonized, in the face of the emphasis given by the colonialist, that is the French, to this or that aspect of his traditions, reacts very violently. Yeah? Their tradition is under assault, their culture is under assault. The attention devoted to modifying this aspect the emotion the conqueror puts into his pedagogical work, his prayers, his threats, weaves a whole universe of resistances around this particular element of the culture. So, in other words, I mean, in a way, what Fanon is describing here is a kind of organicist model of a culture, like any organism that closes in upon itself, tries to defend itself. You could say it's a simplistic model for understanding, but it serves the purpose in this case. That the attempt by the colonizer to change something leads to a violent counter reaction. That's essentially the point. And that is something we should expect. Okay? He's trying to educate his European audience. We should expect this to happen. It's nothing surprising at all. The Algerian woman is not a secret agent. It is without apprenticeship, without briefing, without fuss, that she goes out into the street with 3 grenades in her handbag or the activity report of an area in her bodice. She does not have the sensation of playing a role that she has read about ever so many times in novels or seen in motion pictures. There is not that coefficient of play, of imitation, almost always present in this form of action when we are dealing with a Western woman. What we have here is not the bringing to light of a character known and frequented 1,000 times in imagination or in stories. It is an authentic birth in a pure state, without preliminary instruction. There is no character to imitate. On the contrary, there is an intense dramatization, a continuity between the woman and the revolutionary. The Algerian woman rises directly to the level of tragedy. That's an interesting passage, because the last sentence seems to contradict what the rest of the paragraph is saying. In a sense, what Fanon is acknowledging here is that in a male-dominated society, the future for this activist revolutionary female, he's not able to predict a good one, right? He's not able to predict a good one. Maybe I've gone into a lot of detail here because we were getting into the mechanics of Fanon's mode of argumentation, which I think is helpful. After a certain period, the pattern of activity that the struggle involved shifted in the direction of the European city. The protective mantle of the Kasbah, which is the traditional native quarter, in India it would be called the Black Town, White Town and Black Town, a version of which we heard in our university walking tour today. The almost organic curtain of safety that the Arab town weaves around the native withdrew, and the Algerian woman, exposed, was sent forth into the conqueror's city. The Algerian woman, except for a very few students, must overcome a multiplicity of inner resistances, of subjectively organized fears, of emotions. She must at the same time confront the essentially hostile world of the occupier, the mobilized, vigilant, effective, and efficient police forces. Each time she ventures into the European city, the Algerian woman must achieve a victory over herself, over her childish fears. She must consider the image of the occupier lodged somewhere in her mind and in her body, remodel it, initiate the essential work of eroding it, making it inessential, remove something of the shame that is attached to it, devalidate it. Okay, so something very interesting going on here. In media studies, we are often asked to assume that the flow of information and the process of change in communication is entirely cognitive. It is entirely at the level of rational processing of information, which can be received, traded, etc. And what Fanon is pointing out here is that there is an unconscious aspect to human behavior as well, and the body connects the conscious and the unconscious. And when one tries to modify the body, one is thereby reaching into the unconscious and trying to accommodated to the demands of the present moment. Yeah, so this is actually, it involves a theory of communication which is internal to the body, something that traditional communication studies tends not to pay attention to. Yeah? Questions? Yeah.
Like Fanon using that word body also, because repeatedly in his other text also when he says that, oh my, I think body only make me the man who always questions. So he is again addressing to body only, like that relations, like why he is repeatedly using the word body. That
So you're asking it as a question.
yes,
Why is
sir,
it?
yes.
Yeah, because I think he's aware that the rational mode of engagement only goes so far, which is why he was driven to psychoanalysis on the one hand and to armed struggle on the other. Right? Both are different ways of addressing the body, you could say. Yeah? One must have heard the confessions of Algerian women or have analyzed the dream content of certain recently unveiled women to appreciate the importance of the veil for the body of the woman. Okay, so this is a kind of rare analysis where we're actually seeing it from the perspective of the person wearing the veil. Without the veil, she has an impression of her body being cut up into bits, put adrift. The limbs seem to lengthen indefinitely. When the Algerian woman has to cross a street, for a long time she commits errors of judgment as to the exact distance to be negotiated. The unveiled body seems to escape, to dissolve. She has an impression of being improperly dressed, even of being naked. She experiences a sense of incompleteness with great intensity. She has the anxious feeling that something is unfinished, and along with this, a frightful sensation of disintegrating. The absence of the veil distorts the Algerian woman's corporal pattern. Yeah, she doesn't know how to move her body. She quickly has to invent new dimensions for her body, new means of muscular control. She has to create for herself an attitude of unveiled woman outside. She must overcome all timidity, all awkwardness, for she must pass for a European. And at the same time, be careful not to overdo it, not to attract notice to herself. The Algerian woman who walks stark naked into the European city relearns her body, re-establishes it in a totally revolutionary fashion. This new dialectic of the body and the world is primary in the case of one revolutionary woman. Okay? Questions, comments, thoughts?
It almost feels like it's a struggle of every subaltern woman.
Yes,
Whenever she is
yes.
exposed to any culture, not just a story of any Algerian woman.
Quite true. Quite.
In fact,
So
in
you're
my
saying,
department, ours is a kind of a melting pot. There are several women students who come from buffer areas.
yes,
For the first time, they are exposed to the city environment.
yes.
So it feels like when we talk to them, it's almost like the similar discourse.
Very interesting. Yeah. And of course, the veil makes it, gives a concrete illustration of the kind of hurdles to be overcome. You have to relearn your exposure to the body, of the body to the world, and manage that. Yeah.
But I have, it's a very, in a way, stupid question, but when Fana is giving account of this, so did he manage to speak to women or because
Yes, yeah, he's been as a psychiatrist. He was analyzing their dreams. That's kind of what he indicates here.
because in that time was it possible to talk to them because obviously
If they were wounded, they came to the hospital.
right.
Right. So those are he spoke to the traumatized.
Sir, it feels like he's looking at dichotomies or creating dichotomies in a way. For example, Algerian woman and a European woman.
Sure.
Just like Tagore had this understanding of the home and the world,
Yes.
where woman is basically the home,
Yeah.
and there is an outside world. So it feels like very similar to that,
Right.
where you
Right.
even in the home and the world, if you look at the text or the film, it feels like the Europeanness of a woman is outside the home, but they also create that, right? So here it feels like Algerian woman, if she wants to become European, she has to play to that dichotomy.
Right, but she's also, what Fana was saying is, European should not be the only game in town.
Yeah.
You can also be an Algerian national, where you experience that space in your own way, where you do not submit to their violence. On the contrary, you carry out violence against them. Now, that's crude, violent, but the choices available are extremely limited. So it brutalizes.
But does she remain Algerian then?
Yes, yes, that's the transformation.
While woman,
Absolutely.
she remain Algerian.
Yes, there is a general. So France had passed a law that you cannot, as an Algerian born native, you cannot gain French citizenship unless you renounce Islam. Okay? And as it happens, almost none of the Algerians were willing to renounce their religion. So there itself, he doesn't mention it, but there itself you have your answer. Yeah? Yes?
It's related to the psychological process of that women when they have the well.
Yeah.
What kind of the cultural shift and what is going on in their mind?
That's what he's trying to analyze. Yeah, that's what he's trying to analyze. He's trying to show us the internal resistances that she has to surmount in order to carry out the work of the FLN, National Liberation Front, right? So he's describing what you're asking. Yeah? Okay, all right. Yeah, another question here?
Can we use the word disalienation among those women? Like,
Disalienation.
like,
Say a bit more. I'm not familiar with the term, but I'm open to it. Okay, we can come back to it. Removed and reassumed again and again, the veil has been manipulated, transformed into a technique of camouflage, into a means of struggle. Okay, so here's a dramatic case of how a previously inert element in a traditional society, when you have, so to say, politics being fought by other means and war being fought by other means, the means themselves are constantly changing in their significance, right? They become the carriers of one set of signs, another time they are carriers of another set of signs, right? So you cannot predict in advance what the veil signifies. Yeah, that's the nature of the. In a way, it summarizes what I'm saying. That you can't take the idea of media for granted. You have to see the conflict that may be embedded within the message in order to figure out what work of mediation is being done here. The virtually taboo character assumed by the veil in the colonial situation disappeared almost entirely in the course of the liberating struggle. Even Algerian women, not actively integrated into the struggle, formed the habit of abandoning the veil. It is true that under certain conditions, especially from 1957 onward, the veil reappeared. Okay, so essentially, it went back and forth. Once the French realized that the veil was being used to hide revolutionaries, they began to interrogate veiled women. Previously, they had not done so. So it went back and forth. Colonialism wants everything to come from it, but the dominant psychological feature of the colonized is to withdraw before any invitation of the conquerors. Okay, so here again summarizes the fact that there are knowledge frameworks which refuse each other. The knowledge frameworks refuse each other. Unless we are aware of that, we are going to be misled. Yeah? The colonizer refuses the colonized knowledge frameworks, and therefore vice versa. Colonialism must accept the fact that things happen without its control, without its direction. We are reminded of the words spoken in International Assembly by an African political figure, responding to the standard excuse of the immaturity of colonial peoples and their incapacity to administer themselves. This man demanded for the underdeveloped peoples the right to govern themselves badly. Yeah, the right to govern themselves badly. The doctrinal, because you can say, no, you should govern yourselves as I tell you, therefore let the bombing begin. And if you follow newspapers like the Wall Street Journal, you will find their distinguished commentators will write op-eds saying, let the bombing begin. You know, that's a frequent op-ed headline in newspapers like the Wall Street Journal. So this is kind of remarkable. But so the doctrinal assertions of colonialism in its attempt to justify the maintenance of its domination almost always push the colonized to the position of making uncompromising, rigid, static counter proposals. Okay, so the crudeness of the colonized response is a feature of their constraint, that in a violent context they're only able to respond with counter violence or with similarly crude, rigid, and static countermeasures. It is not the soil that is occupied, it is not the ports or airdromes. French colonialism has settled itself in the very center of the Algerian individual and has undertaken a sustained work of cleanup, of expulsion of self, of rationally pursued mutilation. Maybe one can think about resonances this would have in the context of India's colonization by England, the kind of rational mutilation of the self that perhaps a colonized, English-educated subject of the British, but Indian by birth, what kind of self-mutilation that person might have practiced. We can think about these correspondences. Yeah? There is not occupation of territory on the one hand and independence of persons on the other. It is the country as a whole, its history, its daily pulsation that are contested, disfigured in the hope of a final destruction. Under these conditions, the individual's breathing is an observed and occupied breathing. It is a combat breathing. Yeah? It is a combat that is breathing. So the information might appear to be unilateral or homogeneous, but when you actually understand the context in which it's emerging, it is filled with conflict. And without understanding that conflict, you don't understand it. Yeah? Okay. So here he's discussing the importance of the Algerian woman. So let me go over this entire passage. The Algerian woman's ardent love of the home is not a limitation imposed by the universe. It is not hatred of the sun or the streets or the spectacles. It is not a flight from the world. What is true is that under normal conditions, an interaction must exist between the family and society at large. The home is the basis of the truth of society, but society authenticates and legitimizes the family. In other words, if the colonizer treats these as, again, like a Lego, a set of Lego blocks, in fact, they are connected with each other. The colonial structure is the very negation of this reciprocal justification. So the organic ties between family, larger world, society are negated by colonial governance norms. The Algerian woman, in imposing such a restriction on herself, in choosing a form of existence limited in scope, was deepening her consciousness of a struggle, preparing for combat. This withdrawal, this rejection of an imposed structure, this falling back upon the fertile kernel that a restricted but coherent existence represents, constituted for a long time the fundamental strength of the occupied. Okay? All alone, the woman, by means of conscious techniques, presided over the setting up of the system. So he's actually saying the woman was the absolute basis and motor of the Algerian liberation struggle. And that contrasts with the fact that even in the film Battle of Algiers, it's mostly the men that you see, and the women, although you see the women, veiled women and Europeanized women carrying out attacks or assisting in attacks, they almost never speak. And we'll talk about that in relation to the film when we see the film. But this is noteworthy. All alone, the woman presided over the setting up of the system. What was essential was that the occupier should constantly come up against a unified front. This accounts for the aspect of sclerosis that tradition must assume. So, the appearance of a rigid response that we want the veil, we have a cult of the veil, it was engendered by the circumstances rather than, a kind of automatic reproduction of dead tradition. For revolutionary war is not a war of men. Okay? Again, very clear statement that no gender exclusivity could be meaningfully practiced in a genuinely revolutionary process. The woman's place in Algerian society is indicated with such vehemence that the occupier's confusion is readily understandable. The occupier had assumed that the woman is not important, and he gets the opposite impression. This is because Algerian society reveals itself not to be the womanless society that had been so convincingly described. Side by side with us, our sisters do their part in furthering breaking down the enemy system and in liquidating the old mystifications once and for all. So we'll pause here, it's 1 o'clock, and we'll go to the next chapter after the lunch break. But again, a stirring lesson in media studies, in my opinion, that Fanon offers us. Any questions?
So I'm just curious, I'm trying to frame the question because generally what happens whenever any religion propagates, obviously it propagates through women. And
Yes.
generally when it comes to performing religious rituals,
Yes.
the entire duty is from in any civilization the entire duty is always given to women.
No, but the qazis, the priests, usually the mullahs, they're men.
Huh. So that way the power is kept by men, but when it comes to implementation and adhering to those norms, so those responsibilities are conveniently given to women. As a part of it, often what happens, generally women, in a way, whatever the consciousness or false consciousness which is created, generally they adhere to their cultural roots more rigidly than men. And in India also, there are, in India and abroad, particularly in Middle East, there are quite a few women, particularly in Middle East, what they are not resisting uh, the burqas, the veil. In fact, they are celebrating it and they don't want to give it away. In fact, there are interesting video by some of the social media influencer where they are in a way teaching young Arabic women that how they can enjoy in water park having their hijab.
Right, right.
So all those discourse, they are popular in social media. Uh, when you give example of advertising, again there was very interesting campaign a few years back in India. No bindi, no business campaign. No bindi, no business, because there are quite a few Diwali ads where all the celebrities they are not wearing bindi, and then there are these certain so-called Hindu women. They came on board and they say, Ki, you don't teach me how to practice my religion. If you are not respecting the icons of my own religion, then obviously I have no reason to do business with you. So if you
They're
want,
also pro-Bindi.
huh?
Huh.
So if we are Hindus
The
and
statement you mentioned could be easily an anti-Bindi statement. Right?
exactly. So again, here what is happening now? I want to look at it value neutrally. I don't want to denounce it nor I want to celebrate it. But point remains the same when we are talking about the case of Algerian women. Here in the entire text, I do not see reference of any resistance. So how exactly that issue of resistance, which is seen in other cultures, how it could be understood against the backdrop of this particular text?
I don't understand. See, this is about entire chapter is about the resistance carried out through the women, through the veil, and the shifting meaning of the veil. At one time, they abandoned the veil to At other times, they use the veil to hide the fact that they are actually carrying weapons, even though they look traditional. So it's a shifting meaning. So resistance saturates this text, I would say. Yeah, although the word is not used, right?
The last paragraph is actually about.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, liquidating all the old mystifications once and for all. Yeah, so in a way, he's speaking for the women. I mean, you can't ignore that dimension of it, but he does acknowledge that they're much more important than what they have appeared in the public arena, and that's the first chapter in this book. Yeah.
Again, because we haven't really discussed this particular war and also the
Yeah.
scholarship which is coming. Are there any examples of literature which is coming from the land itself, where the
Sure.
women themselves
Asiya
are
Jabar, yeah, Asiya Jabar is one of the noted authors from Algeria, writing in, in French, but a lot of the work is translated also. Yes, there are several. I also attended films, literature. Thanks to the Francophone influence, perhaps, there is a literature, and it's fairly sizable. Yeah. Yes.
A kind of perverse contemporary example of something like the confusion, the occupiers' confusion, is very visible in the photographs that Israeli soldiers have posed with Palestinian women's undergarments, and it was quite a. I mean, it generated quite a bit of controversy online, where they were kind of posting them look beneath the veil. They are kinky and all of that. It's a very kind of, it's a very contemporary. It's very much the same thing.
We've been exhausted by the stories of Israeli atrocities and beaten and bludgeoned to such an extent. But certainly, if there's comment, we can discuss it. There's a lot to be said, I know. But yes, I mean, earlier there would be atrocities where there was a sense of shame about them, and yes, we see that the Israelis have moved beyond that. And I don't think we can call that progress. Yeah. Yes.
Just one small comment and maybe one question. Comment is like while we were reading a couple of this thing, I was constantly reminded of, at one level, Ashish Nandi was getting echoed. Many of works of Ashish Nandi also talks about, what happens to the indigenous identity and how it reveals and how those forms of revelation can be seen under the colonial rule. So, there was fair deal of parallel that one could draw between some of the work of Nandi and
In a non-revolutionary situation,
in non-revolutionary.
Nandi spoke about the intimate enemy.
Correct.
Yes, and in this revolutionary situation, there was no possibility of speaking about
Correct.
that.
Correct.
So yes, in earlier discussion, I had mentioned in the American context the way in which the question of black-white relations is often referred to is in terms of a peculiar intimacy. Peculiar intimacy, and this registers the fact of a century and a half of industrialized rape to produce African labor for the plantations, and therefore, consequently, extensive racial admixture. Superposed on that, however, a rigid black-whites distinction, yeah, which leads to this peculiar intimacy. And I have black colleagues, I have white colleagues, I have black colleagues who say, I would love to get a DNA report on all those white guys, because they know people masquerading as white are part black. And, so this kind of, that is one aspect of this peculiar intimacy, yeah, that you're both human, and that can register very nicely in this racial ability to racially distinguish, yeah, through genotype, etc. Yeah, so yes, quite right.
And just this question is that, this kind of, feeling of safety under the veil, and veil being the kind of symbol or the location of her strength, born by tradition, this may seem okay against the colonial backdrop or the French backdrop, but once you take it off, suddenly the veil becomes a battleground of um, you know modern versus non-modern, modern versus tradition, liberated versus conservative. So I think unless the whole context of colonialism is put, the veil by itself doesn't remain a neutral site.
Absolutely. I have a friend who's an art historian from NYU, very prestigious degree and all that. His spouse, also Muslim, uh, did her PhD at Stanford or something. She chose to wear the hijab, and she's essentially saying, you think something, look again. I'm not what you think. So she's posing that question that whatever stereotypes you have to test it against the reality that I present before you. And I think that kind of challenge is welcome. We should not apply stereotypes. We should, yes.
A couple of years back, Kamala Das, Malayali writer,
Yes.
I think formally, publicly went and said that I'm going to wear because I feel extremely comfortable, not because you said that I'm religious or something. I'm what I am, you know what.
Yes,
So
yes.
I still prefer to wear that.
Yes, yes, correct. Yeah. So, yeah. So looking at the reality on both sides of the veil, so to say, right? Yeah.
In fact, I'm also struggling to come up with the same thought. Somewhere the colonizer take away that cultural autonomy which he wants to enjoy.
Of
In the name of development, in order to, and somewhere colonizer has this white man's burden that sees a damsel in distress which needs some protection. I'll give that the protection.
Absolutely, yeah. And without understanding that will to power, if we assume that power and knowledge can be separated, and that knowledge can manifest and be appropriated without paying attention to questions of power, well, then our knowledge is flawed. Very simple. Yeah?
Isn't it a question of identity also, as a identity of an outsider, which again Fanon also one more identity which he had was of Negro, like, and somewhere he's mentioned also, like when he's walking and a child says to his mother that look, there's a Negro, I'm scared of him, and that's another identity. And same with the, like, that's somewhere he's talking about how the identity is formed from by the outside, and again which goes to that Simonda's argument that woman is like uh, that one famous line that it's become, one doesn't become a
One is not a
wo-
woman, one becomes a woman.
one becomes a woman. That, yeah.
That's right. Yeah. So, he talks about Jean-Paul Sartre. He presents a phenomenology of how you present yourself in the world, how you proceed in the world, but he doesn't account for the process of racism, which a child can fracture my image of myself. That's what he's saying. I had an image of myself and it is taken away by a remark by a young child, and I'm helpless. Yeah, so he dramatizes this problem. Yes.
Actually, it is a fiction novel by Taslim Anasrin Lajja. So there are few references related to the when she had the well in the personal journey